This is the Nedgroup Investments Podcast, a space where you can learn more about our fund managers, the funds they manage, as well as getting up-to-date and important developments affecting the investment world and how they might be relevant to you. Today I'm chatting with Daniel McDonagh, Portfolio Manager and Head of European Equities at Pyrford International, the portfolio managers of our Global Cautious Fund. Thanks for joining us today, Daniel.
Good morning, Robin. Thank you for the invitation.
So we've been around the country seeing a lot of clients on our roadshow, and one of the things you talked about is the structural problems with the euro and how that's affecting the ability of the economies within the structure to perform well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at the track record of Europe over the last decade, and it's been pretty poor from a growth perspective. They're keeping the same company as Japan, really. They talk about the Japanification of Europe. And we think a key reason behind that poor performance has been some of those structural constraints that are really intrinsic to the single currency's construction. And by that, I mean the inability to depreciate your currency. If you go back to the time before the euro was born, back in 1999, you'll see that these peripheral European economies, the so-called pigs, the Portugals, Italy, Spain and Greece, the way they would reprice themselves into international competitiveness would be to depreciate. And they did that significantly and repeatedly. And that's something that was really taken away from them when the euro was born. They weren't able to do that anymore. And that's where a lot of the imbalances came from in the economy. And that's why it's been such a difficult time for the continent.
And so, but what's the knock-on effect of that, of not being able to depreciate their currency, beg your pardon?
The problem has been that in order to restore that competitiveness that they've lacked, they've had to find another way to do that. And the policy that was really forced upon them was austerity. And of course, austerity does the job, but it does it in a very, very brutal way. So there's the human cost of big spikes in unemployment. There's the problem that it foments the politics of anger at times because of the inequality that it engenders. And of course, there's a lot of bad loans involved that really are still working their way out of the system in places like Spain and Portugal and Ireland, even 10 years after the event. So those austerity policies really took a big pound of flesh from the peripheral economies in Europe.
And did some of the countries do austerity better, if there is a better way of doing austerity?
Yeah, it's a good question. The experiences have been different, and I guess the different experiences have been based on how wholeheartedly you adopted some of those policies that were demanded by the Germans and the European institutions. And places like Portugal really did go, Portugal and Ireland, they're the success stories. They really did go in and try and improve things quickly and decisively.
And we see that in the lower unemployment rates now.
Absolutely. Right? So they've come out the other side far stronger than somewhere like Greece. And Greece obviously had issues in terms of how long it took them to adopt those policies, but also their starting position was much worse, and that counts for a lot as well. Greece was by far the most difficult place for Europe.
And one of the other problems you illustrated within your presentation this week is that there's no real dominance of tech coming through in Europe, like you're seeing around the world in the likes of the US and China. So what effect is that having on European countries and businesses within those countries?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, Europe doesn't do technology very well. The US has FANGs, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Amazons. Europe really doesn't have the equivalent. Its biggest technology company is SAP, which is a fine company, but is much smaller than those names we mentioned. And it's not just that Europe doesn't do technology well, it's the fact that the American technology giants are coming over to Europe and they're using that technology to disrupt the industries that Europe has been traditionally very strong in. Places like the auto sector. It's happening across many, many industries, but the auto sector is the one that gets very high profile. And you can see that in the sense that, you know, Tesla is now, or was recently, a bigger market cap than Volkswagen. Tesla makes less than 500,000 cars a year. Volkswagen makes over 10 million. And I guess that the worry there for the German autos is that they're going to be reduced to just being a dumb manufacturer of a shell of a car, just the chassis, whereas in the future, the value added in self-driving cars will all be in the software, and that's going to be provided by the US firms, it would seem at this point, rather than those European incumbents.
It's quite a pessimistic look on the auto industry in Europe. Don't you think they've got enough cash or capital to throw at R&D to challenge the likes of the newcomers?
They do, and they are trying. It's just that, again, their starting point is that they are behind. If you look at the tests on self-driving cars, you'll see that BMW, Mercedes, they really do struggle compared to the algorithm genius that is Waymo. The other point is that there is cash there. They do have big balance sheets, but they're not as financially strong as perhaps you might imagine. What we've seen is that the auto sector in Europe has really been hurt by twin challenges in recent years. One is a slowdown in the demand in China, which is generally macro related. And the other is there's been a very hesitant consumer in Europe because of regulatory changes. They're not quite sure whether they're going to be able to buy diesel cars or not, and how punitive the authorities and governments will be on those vehicles from a climate change perspective. So they've been holding off on their purchases, and it's actually making it quite difficult for those auto manufacturers to maintain their margins.
Okay, and so we've just had Brexit. We've just had the UK has left the EU. We're officially out of the building. What's been the knock-on impact so far, and also what's the potential knock-on impact? Is it still too early to tell?
So I guess the immediate impact since we left on the 1st of January this year has been very limited, because we've had a withdrawal agreement which basically extends the same situation as we had while we were members of the EU. Going forward, the big factor that the UK will be interested in is what this future trade agreement will look like. And of course, that's being hammered out as we speak. Those negotiations have just begun. On the one hand, the UK would like to would like to have maximum regulatory freedom. They would like to be this low touch, low regulation Singapore on sea, they say, off the northwest coast of Europe. And of course, Europe are very, very keen to prevent that. They talk about having a level playing field. And the idea there is that the UK wouldn't be able to undercut them on things like labour laws or state aid laws, and they wouldn't have to face this competitive threat. So those negotiations are ongoing. If they don't come to fruition, if the deal is not made, then we'll head to WTO, World Trade Organization rules, at the end of this year, so 2020. And that would be materially disadvantageous compared to what we have at the moment.
Will that be beneficial for European businesses?
Not particularly, which is why we suspect that a deal might emerge, especially given the difficulties that both of those economies are going to experience with the coronavirus outbreak. That may be the impetus that we need for them to be sensible and to sit down and negotiate in good faith.
Okay, and then with Brexit leaving, you mentioned this week that the power of the centre of power for Europe has moved south. Would you just explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk a little bit about the responsible north in Europe, which was a group of countries that had like-minded, sort of laissez-faire and fiscally responsible outlooks for the European project. And they're countries that club together, like the UK and Germany and the Scandinavian names. And what they would do was that because they had more than 35% of the European population, they would be able to veto any legislation that they thought would damage the European cause. With the UK leaving, that number, that population share of that responsible north falls to about 28%, which is not enough to block that legislation. Even if you bring in Austria and the Baltics, they're not going to reach that magic 35% number. And what that means is that, as you say, the political centre of gravity is turning south in Europe, and clearly the agenda that the Italians and the Greeks have is not the same as that of the Germans. And I think that might be the real legacy for the EU of the UK leaving. Maybe they'll go on a slightly different path, although we'll probably not see that in any shorter term than the medium term.
So given that a lot of your job is focused on Europe and you kind of rely on the ability to pick some companies from there to have a job, there must be some areas of attraction within the massive amount of companies that are listed in the European exchanges.
Yeah, there absolutely are. And we like to say that these European companies, sometimes they excel in spite of being Europe rather than because of being in Europe. But there are some world beaters at what they do. One company that we've owned for the duration of the relationship with the fund is Air Liquide in France. It's an industrial gases producer. And we like business models like that because it has very high barriers to entry. So the piping system that they have that is entrenched, that's something that's very difficult and expensive to replicate. That's the piping system that they transport their gases around their key markets in. The other aspect we like is that they have very strong contracts with their customers. So it's take or pay. They tend to get their revenues regardless of what the economic circumstances are. And we saw that holding up very well in the great financial crisis back in 2008. It was a business model that proved very resilient, and there's been no material change there in the intervening 12 or 13 years. So businesses like that, we really do feel can, if not flourish, but certainly survive comfortably in difficult times, and that's what we're looking for.
Well, thanks for that on the company specific, but are there any sectors or themes that Europe dominates the world in?
It's hard to say that Europe are particularly strong where there aren't any question marks, partly for those technology reasons. We highlighted the auto sector today, but there really is disruption in almost every sector that you look at, whether it's the tentacles of Amazon trying to come in and steal some of the pie, or whether it is the technology just making sure we do things in a different way. And there's been a significant amount of casualties of that, be it the media companies, some of the travel companies. It really has been pervasive. So Europe still does luxury quite well. Some of those Italian names, the branded goods is something that travel quite well. Sometimes there's a cachet associated with that, made in Europe, with
the history.
Exactly, that or heritage, as they'd like to call it. But of course, that's quite a small sector of the economy, and it is also very cyclical. So there are times when even that looks quite weak.
So you're not really giving us a pitch for Europe, but where else do Pyrford International at this point in time think is an attractive area to invest, especially after what we've just seen this week? Sure.
Well, as a firm, if we look at the fund, of the equity component, 40% of those are in the US, and we've spoken highly, I guess, of the innovative nature of that economy already. The other area that we do harbour hope for is Asia ex-Japan, and we like that region because it has much better demographics than Europe, and that's obviously a key input into long-term growth trend rates. And they've also got a lot less debt than the Western developed world. They had their crisis back in 1997. They learnt from it, and they didn't use debt as aggressively in the run-up to the financial crisis. And those lower debt levels mean that they have the opportunity to use credit creation to try and drive growth robustly forward. And that's a big advantage, we think, over the European continent.
Okay, well, it's been great chatting to you. Thanks very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Robin.
Nedgroup Collective Investments is an authorised collective investment scheme manager in terms of the Collective Investment Schemes Control Act. Nedgroup Investments does not provide advice on financial products and will only give you factual information. For further details on our funds and to view our terms and conditions, please visit nedgroupinvestments.co.za.